Hey there, everybody. Welcome to our celebration of Rosh Hashanah in 2018. And the title of today's lesson is O Holy Night, His Star is Brightly Shining. And that might be a strange lesson or title for a lesson on Rosh Hashanah, but stick with me for a little bit and it will become crystal clear as we continue to go through. Let's start off by going to Leviticus 23. This is the chapter for anybody who wants to understand the feast day calendar that God has set forth and given to his people. He did this right after the Exodus, and the feast day calendar starts in spring with the feast days of Passover, first fruits, and then a 7-week countdown or count up leading towards the Feast of Pentecost. However, those are described in the first half of Leviticus 23. We're going to pick it up in Leviticus 23 verse 24, where we start talking about the first of the fall feasts. So Leviticus 23:24 says, "Speak to the children of Israel, saying, in the 7th month," and that is the 7th month after Passover, "on the first day of the month you shall have a Sabbath rest, a memorial of blowing of trumpets, a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work on it, and you shall offer an offering made by fire to the Lord." Now, this special day is known by a few different names. Here in the Old Testament Hebrew, it's called Yom Teruah, which basically means the day of trumpet blasts or the day of shouting or the day of blasting. And obviously, it's also called Rosh Hashanah, which literally means the chief or the head day or the beginning day of the year. And that's because, again, it's not just the beginning of the fall festivals. It's also on the Jewish civil calendar, the first day of the Jewish New Year. Now, in our concurrent series in the story of God that we're doing, we just talked about the creation week. And Rosh Hashanah is not just the first day of the year, it's the anniversary of the first day of creation, as we have shared many times in the past. And as most of us know, it's also the anniversary of the birth of the man Jesus, the Christ, who is the only begotten Son of the living God. Now, we'll need to talk about both of those facts in a moment. But Rosh Hashanah is important for a couple of other reasons. One is that it kicks off what's called the 10 days of awe. And these are the 10 days that lead up to the Day of Atonement. And tradition is that during each of the 10 days of awe leading up to that Day of Atonement, the priest would blow the shofar or the ram's horn, and it would act as serve as a call for self-reflection and repentance, to have the people of the nation of Israel preparing their hearts, waiting for that day when the high priest would enter the Holy of Holies with blood of an innocent animal to atone for the sins of the nation for the past year. And every day on the Day of Atonement, the people would wait outside the temple with bated breath to see if the priest would emerge alive and hence be in another year of God's grace where he has delayed judgment. So we have Rosh Hashanah, we have the 10 days of awe, we have the Day of Atonement, and then 5 days after the Day of Atonement is what is called the Feast of Tabernacles, or Sukkot, and this is coming up on us fairly quickly. And Sukkot, or the Feast of Tabernacles, is 7 days of feasting and dwelling in sukkah, or what are called booths, oftentimes just tents or lean-tos, and that's followed by an 8th day, or on the 8th day, by an assembly that includes animal sacrifices and all the like. And you can read about those in the remaining verses in Leviticus 23. I just wanted to show you in the Bible where it talks about Yom Teruah or talks about Rosh Hashanah, the head day or the chief day. Now, we have in our ministry and in our fellowship, we've celebrated Rosh Hashanah for many years now. And the message each year has been similar, which it should be, because the message doesn't and has not changed. But this year, I want to do something a little bit different, not in what we talk about, because we can't change the story ourselves, but there are some details that we can focus on that maybe we haven't focused on before. If you remember last year, we talked about how Jesus was born of the seed of a woman in the womb of a man, and talking about his miraculous birth. But this year, we're not just going to talk about the creation and the birth of Christ, we're going to do it with a little bit of a twist. I want you to go back now to Genesis chapter 49. Genesis chapter 49. If you'll remember from some of our other studies, the first mention of a Redeemer in the Bible is in the book of Genesis, in Genesis 3:15, where after Adam and Eve fall to temptation, God curses the serpent, then he curses the woman, and he says that the seed of the woman would bruise the head of the seed of the serpent, and the seed of the serpent would bruise the heel of the seed of the woman. And this is ultimately talking about the struggle between Christ and Satan, or Christ and Antichrist as his proxy. I want you to fast forward from that first day of creation. Actually, it would be the 10th day of creation. My apologies. Fast forward about 2,300 years in the biblical timeline, or about 2,700 years before Christ, and we see Jacob on his deathbed blessing his 12 sons. Let me make a correction, about 1,700 years before Christ, and we see Jacob on his deathbed blessing each of his 12 sons. So in Genesis chapter 49, verse 10, he's going through his sons, and he comes to his son Judah. And he says in verse 8, actually, let's start in verse 8. And I'm reading from the Septuagint here, by the way. Judah, may your brothers praise you. May your hands be upon the back of your enemies. The sons of your father will revere you. A cub of a lion, Judah. From a shoot, my son, you went up. After lying back, you slept like a lion and like a cub. Who will stir him up? A ruler will not cease from Judah, and one who leads from his thighs until the things laid away for him come, and he is the expectation of the nations. Now, the New King James has different wording in verse 10. I'll just read that. Most of you probably have that, or something very similar to this, where it says, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh comes, and to him shall be the obedience of the people. Now, I think the Septuagint captures the expectation and the hope of the Jews, that at some point, even Job said, I know my Redeemer lives. And he talks about how someday he would see him with his own eyes. Let's continue on in verse 8. Binding his foal to a vine and the foal of his donkey to the branch, he will wash his garment in wine and his cloak in the blood of grapes. His eyes gladdened more than wine, and his teeth bright as milk. And this reference to binding his foal to a vine and the foal of donkey to his branch really, I think, should evoke images of Christ coming into the city of Jerusalem, coming in on a donkey. And he actually had sent, in preparation for the first Passover, not the first Passover, but in preparation for the Passover that's recorded in the Gospels, the one that we focus on, he sent his disciples into the city and said, when you go in there, you'll find a foal. And I think this is referring to that. And also there's prophecy here that talks about Christ, and it talks about his eternal kingship. And we know this, right? We know from the beginning of the Bible, the end of the story was already written. The Father saw all of this in his omniscience, and he wrote it down, and he wrote it for our benefit, for our record. Now, go to Numbers chapter 24. Numbers 24. Now, during the 40 years that the early Jews wandered in the desert, we're fast forwarding again now. We were just about 1,700 years before Christ. Now it's a couple of hundred years later. This is about 1,500 years before Christ. The Jews, while they wandered in the wilderness, they came against many enemies, and they were constantly waging war and trying to protect themselves. And one of these enemies was a man named Balak, who was the king of a group of people called the Moabites. And in coming up against the Moabites, in fact, the Jews had just come off a resounding victory over one of the other neighboring nations. And the king of Moab was very distraught because there was a lot of Jewish people, a lot of Jewish soldiers. And because they were, at that time at least, obeying God, they were having great victory, great military victories. And so Balak sought to extract a prophecy from a man or a prophet named Balaam. And he wanted him to prophesy against Israel and for himself, for his own nation of Moab. And 3 times he asked Balaam to prophesy against Israel But he didn't. Every single time when he went to open his mouth, God basically said, here's what I want you to say. And every single time Balaam prophesied for Israel and against Balak and against Moab. And the fourth time when Balak asked him to do it again, God had had enough. And here's what he says in Numbers 24, verse 17. And this is Balak now prophesying, but he's actually prophesying about this coming Redeemer, this Christ. He says, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob. And the Septuagint has a little bit different wording. It says, a star shall rise up out of Jacob. A scepter shall rise. Or the Septuagint says, a man will be established out of Israel, and batter the brow of Moab, and destroy all the sons of tumult or chaos. So between Jacob's prophecy and Balaam's prophecy, we see this concept of a scepter representing a king or a ruler. But now through Balaam, he adds the statement that a star will rise up out of Israel, and that is unique to Balaam's prophecy. And again, this is about 1,500 years before the birth of Christ. Now let's go to 2 Samuel chapter 7. And what we're doing is we're starting from the beginning, and then we're just going forward in little jumps and little skips. And I'm showing you all the different places where the coming of this Christ is prophesied in different ways and different terminology. So 2 Samuel chapter 7, and now we are about 1,000 years before Christ. And here we are during the time of King David. The Jews have stopped wandering from place to place. They settled down in Jerusalem after, they conquered the city of Jebus. David tells his friend and prophet Nathan that he said, I live in a great house, but God lives in a tent. And he said to Nathan, I want to build God a great house for him to live in. But God speaks prophecy through Nathan that he himself, that God will build David a house. And he's talking about a dynasty to rule on the throne of Israel. And this is what we call, part of what we call the Davidic covenant. So 2 Samuel 7, verse 12. And it will happen if your days are fulfilled and you sleep with your fathers, that I will raise up your descendants from you who will be from your belly, and I will establish his kingdom. Now, that word belly in the Greek is koilia, and it literally means womb, right? And this is where last year we talked about how the Christ was born from the seed of the woman, and that would be Mary. And we get that from Genesis 3:15. But he would also be born from the womb of David, and we get that right here from 2 Samuel verse 12. He will build a house for me, for my name, and I will establish his throne forever. And now God is talking about a descendant of David who would be on the throne of David into eternity. I will be like a father to him, and he will be like a son to me. And if he should demonstrate injustice, then I will disgrace him with the rod of man and with the wounds from the sons of mortals. But I will not withdraw my compassion from him as I withdrew it from those whom I withdrew from my presence, and his house as well as his kingdom will be made steadfast before me forever, and his throne will be established forever. And again, this is all about Christ being the seed of the woman, born from among the tribe of Judah, and from the tribe of Judah coming specifically from the line of David. Again, talking about from the belly of David, from the womb of David, and this is referring to his descendant Mary, who would ultimately become pregnant without the action of a human male being part of that process. So without getting into that story again, well, actually, let me go through, just because I know that some of you guys that are in the local fellowship, you weren't here with us last year when we did this. So let me just go through just a couple of basic things. Again, talking about where the reference in verse 12 is to David's womb. This is referring to Mary, his descendant who ultimately would be the mother of the Messiah. And I don't want to get too far off. It's a very related concept. But again, back in Genesis 15, the Messiah was prophesied to come from the seed of a woman. And so how can Messiah come from the seed of a woman? That word seed literally means sperm. So women don't have sperm, men don't have wombs. So the answer, of course, is supernatural. These are, somewhat metaphors, but what it's talking about is how God created the man Christ, or the man Jesus, inside the virgin womb of Mary. And it's important for us to be, I think, clear on this, is that, when the Father begat the Son, and in reality, Christ has two beginnings, if you will. In fact, Paul in the book of Hebrews chapter 10, he quotes from Psalm 40 in the Septuagint version, where he says in Hebrews 10, he says, therefore, when he came into the world, obviously talking about Christ being born, he said, sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but a body you have prepared for me. And when we go back to the message that we taught last year, the miracle of Christ's birth as a man was not just that Mary had a baby without having known a man intimately, but at the moment that the Son emptied himself of all that made him divine kind and equal with the Father, at that moment the Father had prepared a body for the Son and inserted it into the virgin womb of Mary. And in essence, the Son was begotten of the Father on the very first Rosh Hashanah. And the person of the Christ, the person of the Son, was then created as a full human on the 4,000th anniversary of Rosh Hashanah, the very first one. And that would be, 80 Jubilee cycles after the events that are recorded in Genesis 1:1. And I say created, not begotten, and not procreated. Those are all different things, right? Begotten would be where the Father took the Son out from within himself, created a separate entity, but of the same essence and same kind. Creation would be what we saw in Genesis 1, where Adam was created when God took the dust of the earth and blew into his face the breath of life, and he became a living soul. God also created Eve by taking a bone from Adam's side and created Eve from that. But from that point forward, all humans were procreated, where a husband and a wife got together and they were intimate and they produced a baby that was of the same essence as both of the parents, except for Christ. Christ is the only one who was created as a human aside from Adam and Eve, because God prepared a body for him and inserted him as an independent person into the womb of Mary, but as a complete human. And so he was very unique in that sense. Now, having said that, that's really not my focus today. I want you to go to Micah chapter 5. Micah chapter 5. So again, we're continuing to move closer to the time of Christ, and right now we're about 700 years before Christ was born. The prophet Micah was a contemporary of the prophet Isaiah, and they both predated one of the main prophets, Jeremiah, by about 50 years. Warned Israel about the coming captivity at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon. And this is the key verse that told the ancient Jews that their Messiah, the lion and the scepter of Judah, the seed of David who would establish David's throne forever, that this Messiah would be born in the city called Bethlehem. Micah 5, verse 2, and I'm reading again now from the Septuagint. And you, O Bethlehem, house of Ephrathah, and Ephrathah is basically an ancient name for Bethlehem. You are very small to be in the thousands of Judah, from which for me one will come out to be a ruler of Israel, and his goings out, literally the word exoduses, are from the beginning, from days of old. So we have this prophecy that the Messiah would come from the line of David, specifically in the city. And so this is, if you look on the screen, this is what we have so far. We have a role. We have someone who was going to be a ruler, to be a king, really an eternal king. Someone that would be a Messiah, a redeemer, a savior. And there's many other labels, I guess, or titles that we could put in there. We also have a very distinct lineage. We go from Abraham to Isaac, to Jacob, to the tribe of Judah, and specifically within the tribe of Judah to a man named David. And we know that the Messiah was going to come from his descendants. And we also now have a location, which is Bethlehem. What we don't have is we don't have a time frame. Right? So far in the Bible, if you were just reading forward from the book of Genesis, you wouldn't know yet at what point the Messiah would be born, but that information is coming. Now, what we know about history is that the King David died and his son Solomon took over and he built the first temple. David started it, drew up the plans, but Solomon completed it. And Solomon, as a king, started out well and looks like he may have ended well towards the end of his life. He may have repented. But in between, he did everything wrong. He married hundreds of foreign wives for geopolitical gain and advantage, and he implemented pagan worship, and he himself began to worship pagan gods. And as a result, God punished him. So I want you to go to 1 Kings chapter 11. 1 Kings 11. I'm going to read in verse 7. 1 Kings 11:7. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, on the hill that is east of Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abomination of the people of Ammon. And he did likewise for all his foreign wives who burn incense and sacrifice to their gods. So the Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned from the Lord God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice, and had commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods, but he did not keep what the Lord had commanded. Therefore the Lord said to Solomon, because you have done this and have not kept my covenant and my statutes which I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom away from you and give it to your servant. Nevertheless, I will not do it in your days for the sake of your father David. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. However, I will not tear away the whole kingdom. I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. So what ended up happening after Solomon died was that the kingdom split in two, and there were two tribes that stayed faithful and loyal. That was the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin in the south. Benjamin was the tribe that God said he would give his son to continue on in that southern kingdom. But the northern 10 tribes went north, and they went pagan, and they continued in pagan ways. And they were not long after captured and conquered by the Assyrians. And not long after the northern tribes were conquered and captured by the Assyrians, the Babylonians came down and they conquered the Assyrians and inherited all the northern tribes and all of those people as slaves. But then the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar continued on, of course, and they conquered the southern tribe of Judah and Benjamin, and they took them captive for 70 years in Babylon, and that was in fulfillment of a prophecy that you can read about back in Leviticus. I believe it's in chapter 26, and that was all spoken in the days of Moses, which happened about 500 years before these events that we're talking about. Now, with respect to the Babylonian captivity, the first wave of the Babylonian captivity was about 586 years before Christ. And I say the first wave because there wasn't just one deportation where Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian armies came in and took people away. What these ancient warrior kingdoms did was they came in and they conquered a people, and then they would take the king and the king's family and all the officials, and they would put their people in place in positions of power and authority to govern the nation. So they wouldn't take everybody. They would, maybe take a few hundred people, sometimes a few thousand, depending on what the population was. But Nebuchadnezzar came down several times and had to put down rebellions, and each time he took more people. Now, one of the captives that was taken into Babylon in that first wave was a young man of Judah, a descendant of David. And this man's name was Daniel. So let's go to Daniel chapter 2. Now I'm going to skip some detail here just simply for the sake of time. But I want you to know that in Daniel chapter 9, there is what is commonly called the 70-week prophecy. And this is really the only time clue that the Bible contains that foretells when the Messiah would come. Daniel's prophecy in chapter 9 allowed Jewish scholars to know precisely the year that the Messiah would be born and precisely the year that the Messiah would be crucified. They just didn't pay attention all that well, apparently. Nevertheless, we're going to go to Daniel chapter 2, verse 47. Now, the context here is that King Nebuchadnezzar, he's the leader of the Babylonians, had a troubling dream, and this is a very famous dream that relates to end times prophecy. But he had this dream that his wise men were not able to interpret. And these wise men were called, in Hebrew, they were called Hakim. In Greek, if you were to look at the Septuagint, these wise men were called Sophistes. And in New Testament Greek, these same men are actually called Magi. And while they were certainly practicing pagan occultism, and there was a lot of debate about the specific religion that these men were following, some talk about Zoroaster or I can't pronounce it. Anyways, let me just kind of go back to my main line here. While they were certainly practicing a pagan occultism, and they were priests, they were very learned men. They were astronomers more than they were astrologers. And a lot of times when we talk about the Magi in biblical context, a lot of times people will use the term magician and refer to, not the stage magic that we might think about today, but talking about magicians and sorcerers, etc. But really, they were more astronomers. In fact, the Babylonians, the ancient Chaldeans, which were the forerunners of the Babylonians, by secular people were credited as being the ones who brought knowledge of the stars and astronomy to the rest of the world. Now, interestingly enough, the Jewish historian Josephus says that it was actually Abraham who brought the knowledge of the stars to the Chaldeans, who then, of course, eventually transitioned, if you will, into the Babylonians. Nevertheless, in the time of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar has this crazy dream, and these learned and wise men couldn't interpret the dream. And just when Nebuchadnezzar was fed up with his wise men who weren't so wise, and he was about to kill them all in a rage, an advisor comes in and says, hey, we've got this guy here named Belteshazzar, and that was Daniel's Babylonian name. And he says, he can interpret your dream. And so he does, and this is, again, the famous dream of Nebuchadnezzar that figures prominently into, the March of Nations, from the Babylonians to the Persians to the Greeks, and then eventually the Romans. And again, it's a key aspect of end times prophecy. But for this story and the lesson that we're talking about today, I want you to look at how the king responded. How did Nebuchadnezzar respond when Daniel revealed the meaning of the dream, which he was given by God Almighty? Daniel 2, verse 46. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king, falling forward on the ground, worshipped Daniel and ordered offerings and libations to be presented to him. And the king cried out to Daniel, saying, your God is certainly a God of gods and a Lord of kings, one who alone discloses hidden mysteries, because you were able to clearly make known this mystery. Then King Nebuchadnezzar, when he had extolled Daniel and presented great and many gifts, he established him over the administration of Babylon and appointed him as overseer and head of all the wise men in Babylon, all of the Magi, all of the Hakim, all of the Sophistes of Babylon. And Daniel entreated the king in order that they would set up over the administration of Babylon his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And Daniel was in the royal court. Now, Daniel 6, verse 28 says that Daniel continued to serve in Babylon under Cyrus, the king of the Persians. And there's no indication in the scriptures that he ever went back to Israel. In fact, we know that if you recall the story of Daniel in the lion's den, which is found in Daniel chapter 5, and this is before the 70-year captivity was over, Daniel was probably in his mid-80s. He was probably somewhere around 14 years old when he was taken from Jerusalem into Babylon, and he was there for 70 years at least, because at some point in Daniel, he talks about how, having read the old prophets, he knew that the end of the 70-year captivity was coming. So he was probably in his mid-80s when he was thrown into the lion's den. Now, Daniel had been so blessed by God with wisdom and with insight that he was one of 3 governors who served immediately under King Darius of the Medes, who was a co-regent with Cyrus the Persians, or Cyrus of the Persians. And Darius was considering making him his right-hand man, his number 2, and placing him over the entire realm when his enemies devised a plan that ended up with him being thrown into the lion's den. And of course, it's a different story. But my point is that Daniel lived in Babylon under King Nebuchadnezzar as the leader over these wise men. And then he was the governor, or a governor, in the vast Medo-Persian Empire, which encompassed Israel, but also most of everything to the east of Israel at that time. Now, I want you to keep that in mind, that Daniel was a prominent figure who was a governor and an overseer of the wise men of these nations. Keep that in mind now. Let's go to Matthew chapter 2. Matthew chapter 2. We're going to start in verse 1. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem. And these wise men are the same Magi that we were just talking about, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him. And that's where I got the title for this particular lesson. O holy night, his star is brightly shining. They said, we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him. Now let's pick this apart just a little bit. These wise men from the east, like that phrase from the east, the Greek word for east is Anatoli, and it literally means from the rising. And there was really no specific words that meant like north, south, east, or west. And in fact, if they wanted to say that something came from the east, they would say something came from the rising. And if they wanted to say they were going towards the west, they would say we're going to the setting. So the word from the east literally means from the rising. And these Persian Magi, or these Eastern Magi, I'm making an assumption when I say Persian because they certainly could have been Babylonian, but these Persian Magi, let me just read to you a few things from the Encyclopedia Iranica. From at least the time of Darius I onwards, the Magi were the official priests and played an important role at the royal court and enjoyed a great influence, along with their religious functions. Because remember, they were priests, and there is debate among scholars, even Middle Eastern scholars, whether the Magi were a tribe of the Medes or if they were just a priestly class, but not specifically only from one tribe. Nevertheless, they were priests, but along with their religious functions, they were also engaged in administrative and economic activities. These Magi probably came to Babylonia to perform religious rituals for the Persians and the Medes, who stayed in that country as royal officials and soldiers. Babylonian texts mention Magi in connection with their administrative tasks, as well as witnesses in legal and economic documents along with the Babylonians. So they were most certainly pagan priests. However, they were also astronomers. They had a vast knowledge of science and the stars. They were economists. They were legal witnesses. They were tutors, and they taught the children, specifically the sons of the Persian kings. They took part in coronation ceremonies whenever new king was crowned. And in fact, if there was ever a debate as to who the rightful heir to a throne was, often it was the Magi who made the distinction between the true king and the pretender. They were also court counselors. They were advisors to the king. They were, in other nations, known as kingmakers. They went before the Persian armies singing ancient religious hymns, and they guarded the tomb of Cyrus the Great. And despite what you might see, and in fact, if you look at the slide on the shaded images in the background, you see 3 men and some camels. But the Persians rode horses. They didn't ride camels. They were actually very accomplished horse riders and military people. And because the Magi were very, very important people who functioned in an official capacity, when they traveled, they didn't travel alone. They actually traveled with a small army, a complement of military men that would protect them. And think about that. When you read the story, the Christmas story, if you will, and you read about these wise men coming into Jerusalem, it wasn't just these three men by themselves. They were accompanied by a small army, and they were basically official visitors from another king, from another nation. There would have been a lot of fanfare, but none of that is actually mentioned in the Bible. So that's a little bit background on these magi. And of course, we also know that it's an assumption that there were three magi, and typically that's assigned to the fact that they gave three different kinds of gifts to the Messiah, to the Christ child. They gave gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But nowhere is it stated that there were only three magi. There could have been 15. There could have been 6. We don't know. We just know that there were more than one because it's plural. Now, in those verses that we just read, when they came to Herod, they said, "Where is he who has been born king?" Notice they asked where the king was born and not if the king was born. This implies a very strong expectation and a trust that the king would have been born. There was no doubt in their mind. And I want you to pause for a second and ask yourself, where did that come from? Where did that trust and that expectation come from? Do we think, or do you think, that some pagan priest received a prophetic vision from Jehovah, the God of the Jews? Probably not. More than likely, their expectation of the birth of the King of the Jews came from Daniel himself. There is a story in Jewish oral tradition that when Cyrus, the king of Persia, conquered the Babylonians, that it was Daniel who showed Cyrus the scroll of Isaiah, especially Isaiah chapter 5, where God calls Cyrus by name and says that he was going to let his people go back. And what's interesting is that Isaiah was written several hundred years before Cyrus was even born, and he was so struck with that he thought, this can only be from God, and I must let these people go. And in the book of Ezra chapter 1 opens with Cyrus crediting Jehovah for his success and his dominion over the world, and declares that God has commanded him to let the Jewish people go back and rebuild their temple and to rebuild their city. So we can place the expectation and the hope of these Eastern Magi, their expectation that the Messiah would be born, we can place that directly at the feet of Daniel. So here's my question. Do you think Daniel just simply stopped and he told Cyrus, hey, our guy Isaiah a couple of hundred years ago said you were going to show up and you're going to have to let us go. Do you think he stopped there? Probably not. He was a trusted advisor. He was a governor. He was the head of the Magi and the wise men. Long before Cyrus came along, he was probably sharing Jewish history and prophecy with the men that he was overseeing. He was a trusted advisor to Darius. Cyrus accepted Isaiah's prophecy on the word of Daniel. And again, I suggest we credit Daniel for instructing the Magi on Daniel's own prophecy about the birth of the Savior that was contained in Daniel's prophecy from Daniel chapter 9, which of course he was given when he was in captivity in that part of the Middle East. If we go back and look at those verses again, they said, we have seen his star in the east. When he's talking to Herod, we have seen his star in the east. Now, they didn't say, hey, we saw a star and it was kind of weird and different and we thought something special might be going on. No, they said we saw his star. They started saying, where the one who has been born king, where is he? We saw his star in the east. Now is the time to recall Balaam's prophecy, where Balaam said, back in Numbers 24, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star arises out from Jacob, and a scepter will rise from Israel. And again, Matthew 2:2 says, for we have seen his star in the east, and we've come to worship him. Now, in Matthew 2:2, the language actually is somewhat ambiguous. When they said, we have seen his star in the east, what does that mean? Does that mean that wherever they were when they saw the star, that the star was to the east of their position, towards the horizon where everything rose like the sun and we have the ecliptic rotating around the axis of the earth? Or does it mean that they were in the east relative to Jerusalem, where they were when they were speaking to Herod, and they themselves were in the east when they saw the star actually rising over Jerusalem? Now, grammatically, it can be either one. It's absolutely impossible to distinguish between those possibilities based on the language. So here's the solution, I think. First of all, there was something unique and different about this star. Again, they called it his star for a reason. And I will tell you that if you do some research on the Christmas star, you'll see a lot of Christian astronomers who have tried to explain this by connecting it with some kind of rare what they call a triple conjunction between a star called Regulus, which is interestingly enough part of the constellation of Leo, the lion. So some type of triple conjunction between Regulus and the planet Jupiter. Others have put forward other potential explanations, but listen, they all fail on a simple level. And that is that a natural phenomena cannot explain what Matthew and the Magi are describing. For something to be a sign, it has to be supernatural. Otherwise, it's just something that would happen in nature, and there's nothing special about it, including some of these conjunctions, which can happen with some frequency. Now, as far as the star goes, apparently neither the Jews nor the Romans in Jerusalem seem to have noticed it. And if they did, they certainly didn't attach much significance, at least to what Matthew records. So at the very least, the star was either something they had seen before and was no big deal, or perhaps the sign was very special, but perhaps it was faint. And maybe only someone who was looking for it at a very specific time was actually going to see it. They had to be looking in the right place at the right time. I want you to also notice that if they saw the star, like when they said we saw the star in the east, if that meant that they saw the star rising in the east relative to their own location, which is what natural law would demand of a natural phenomena, then why on earth would they see the star, his star, the star that foretold the birth of the king of the Jews? Why would they see the star in the east and say, let's go west to Jerusalem? Either the star rose in the east like all the other stars, and Daniel told them, hey, when you see the star in the east, go west to Jerusalem. Or, which is what I believe, the star actually rose in the west over Bethlehem, completely counter to natural law on God's command. He created a supernatural phenomena that alerted those who were watching and waiting. Now, if you read the account, it also appears that the Magi lost sight of the star once they were in Jerusalem. They asked Herod where the king had been born, and Herod didn't know. I mean, and furthermore, why go to Jerusalem and not to Bethlehem? Because the Jews knew that the Messiah was going to come from Bethlehem. Well, part of the issue is that if you're in the east in Babylon or Persia, and you're looking to the west towards Jerusalem, because Bethlehem is only about 6 miles immediately south of Jerusalem, a star over Bethlehem would simply look like it was rising over the city of Jerusalem, which of course is the capital city and the home of the ancient kings of Israel. So it would make sense that they would go to Jerusalem first. Now, one final note before we read on in verse 3. Notice that the Magi said that they were looking for the one who has been born King of the Jews, which is actually strange terminology because kings aren't born. Heirs are born. Princes inherit their father's throne at some point. Kings aren't simply born. But again, see the certainty and see the trust that they have in Daniel's word. All right, let's continue on in verse 3. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And when he had gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. So they said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet, But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not the least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod, when he had secretly called the wise men, determined from them what time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the young child, and when you have found him, bring word back to me, that I may come and worship him also." And you can also almost hear his, deceptive, snide voice. But notice, he had to ask the wise men when the star appeared. They didn't notice. They hadn't seen it. Verse 9, when they heard the king, they departed. And behold, the star which they had seen in the east went before them, till it came and stood over where the young child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceedingly great joy. And when they had come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented gifts to him, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And again, that's where the idea that there were 3 wise men came from, but it really doesn't say that. Then, being divinely warned in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed for their own country another way. Now, notice this. The star went before them and led them to Joseph and to Mary's house. It moved, and then it stayed still over the house itself. So a couple of questions here. Why did Herod secretly call the wise men to him to ask when they saw the star? Why do you think? Well, if the Jewish leaders had heard that a king had been born, they probably would have warned the Magi to stay away from Herod, and probably would have been looking for their king to establish him on his throne. And that was certainly not something that Herod wanted to trigger. Again, it's important to know that all of the nativity scenes that we've all grown up with, seeing where we have the wise men with the baby Jesus in the manger, they're all wrong, because they put the Magi in the location and the time when Christ was born. I want you to drop down to verse 13 for a moment. This is a little bit later when Joseph was warned to flee Egypt. Now, when they had departed, they being the Magi, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, "Arise, take the young child and his mother, flee to Egypt, and stay there until I bring you word, for Herod will seek the young child to destroy him." When he arose, he took the young child and his mother by night and departed for Egypt, and was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the Lord through the prophet, saying, "Out of Egypt I called my son." In verse 16, we see Herod issuing a decree to kill all males under the age of 2 years old. Then Herod, when he saw that he was deceived by the wise men, was exceedingly angry, and he sent forth and put to death all the male children who were in Bethlehem and all its districts, from 2 years old and under. And notice this, according to the time which he had determined from the wise men. And then Matthew points out that this had actually been prophesied by the prophet Jeremiah, that there would be great weeping and mourning for the murders that happened. So the wise men told Herod that they had seen the star, somewhere up to 2 years prior. That's why Herod said, "Kill all kids 2 years, all male children 2 years and under." Now, I imagine if I were Herod and the wise men told me that they saw the star 2 years ago, I would probably kill all three-year-olds and under. I probably shouldn't say that on a recording. But if I were Herod in the biblical time, if someone said to me, "Yeah, it took 2 years for us to get here," or "we saw the star 2 years ago," I would probably hedge my bets and issue the decree to have all kids under 3, all male children under 3 dealt with. So maybe it wasn't 2 years. I mean, maybe they saw the star 1.5 years, and Herod was just again hedging his bets because he didn't want to miss his opportunity. Now, what that means is that maybe the wise men waited a period of time before they actually started their journey. We'll talk about distance and time here in a second. Nevertheless, the idea here is that by the time the Magi showed up, Jesus was not a baby anymore. He was a toddler. Let me go back again to verse 9. When they heard the king, they departed. When they heard the king say that he was going to be born in Bethlehem, they departed, and behold, the star which they had seen in the east went before them till it came and stood over where the young child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceedingly great joy. And when they had come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. So note that Jesus was in a house. He wasn't in a barn. He wasn't in a manger. Matthew uses the word for a young child here. He doesn't use the word for a baby or a newborn. And in Luke's account, Luke, which we'll get to at the end, Luke, when he talks about the babe lying in a manger wrapped in swaddling clothes, he uses the Greek word brephos, but Matthew calls Jesus a paidion, which is a young child, a toddler. So we know that Jesus was no longer, he just wasn't a newborn when the Magi showed up. Also, I want you to notice that Matthew says in this account that when the Magi departed for Bethlehem, the star appears to have become visible to them again. And it moves, it guides them to the very house where Mary and Joseph were living in Bethlehem. And again, there's no fanfare from the Jews, neither in Jerusalem or locally in Bethlehem. So here's a question. If the Magi showed up maybe 1.5 to 2 years after they saw the star and the Christ was born, how long do you think the star was visible for after it showed up at its very first moment? And I will tell you, up until recently, honestly, up until I was preparing for this particular lesson, I would have told you that the star appeared and the Magi set out on a journey right away that took them close to 2 years to complete, and the whole time they were following the star and following the star and following the star. But I want you to remember this, that this was the ancient Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire was well known for its well-maintained and extensive road system. Now, the road system from the Empire of Rome may not have reached all the way into Babylon and Persia. However, we know that there were access routes from Babylon and Persia to Jerusalem because over time, like Jerusalem and even further in Egypt and Africa, the Jews and the Egyptians were constantly fighting with the Syrians, with the Babylonians, with the Persians. And if there was no easy access for the Babylonians, the Persians, the Syrians to get to Jerusalem or past Jerusalem to Egypt, they wouldn't have conquered these people. So access was probably pretty easy. Now, on top of that, Stanford University has an online project called Orbis, which is actually pretty cool. It allows you to designate 2 different locations in the ancient Roman Empire, tell the program, it's a computer program, tell the program how you want to travel between those 2 points. Do you want to go on foot? Do you want to ride a horse? Do you want to be in a caravan? Do you want to be on a coach? And it will tell you how long it will take in ancient Rome, or would have taken in ancient Rome, to make the trip that you designated. So let's assume for the moment, let's assume that the Magi were traveling in a small band using horses, and in ancient travel time and distance, a horse could cover maybe 30 to 35 miles per day. So going from Baghdad in Babylon to Jerusalem, which is about 600 miles or so, the journey only would have taken about 3 to 4 weeks if you're trekking 30 to 35 miles per day. Now, if we assume that the Magi were coming from, maybe the border between modern day Iraq and Iran, or Babylon and Persia, maybe we double the distance and we say it's 1,000 to 1,200 miles, it still would have only taken the Magi a couple of months to come from the east and arrive in Jerusalem. It certainly would have not taken 2 years. That's just really quite out of the question. And what this implies is that if the Magi showed up when the Christ child was close to 2 years old, having seen the star at the time of his birth, there was a delay between when they saw the star and when they actually left Babylon or Persia to find him. Which leads me to another question. if there was a delay in departure, and honestly, even if there wasn't and the trip took 2 full years, which it didn't, the question is this: was the star constantly visible, and was it their constant guide and point of reference to find Jerusalem? Now, if we've already concluded and if we can agree that the Magi knew maybe of Balaam's prophecy about a star rising out of Jacob because they had Daniel's influence, if we can assume that they understood Daniel's 70-week prophecy and what that meant for the time of the birth of Christ, and if we also understand that the Babylonians and the Persians knew exactly where Jerusalem was, what makes us think that the Magi needed the star to guide them at all, other than to signal the time of Christ's birth and that he had finally come, as was prophesied? Or to say it another way, the Magi did not need the star to guide them. They could easily find their way on their own. All they needed was the right timing. That's all they needed the star for. This would explain why the Jews in Jerusalem didn't seem to be all up in arms or excited when the Magi arrived, other than the fact that, hey, we've got a delegation from the east. They weren't looking for their own Messiah because the star wasn't in the sky anymore. And it was likely that the star showed up once, long enough for anyone who was looking specifically for his star, for the sign that the Messiah was to be born, long enough for them to know that the time is now, and then the star disappeared. And it disappeared until the Magi met with Herod a couple of years later and were told of Micah's prophecy that he would be born in Bethlehem. Let's go back to verse 9 again and read it a little bit more carefully. When they heard the king, they departed, and behold, the star which they had seen, and that's in the past tense, the star that they had seen in the east went before them, till it came and stood over where the young child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceedingly great joy. Now, why did they rejoice with exceedingly great joy? If they had been following this star all along, and they'd been following it, especially if you think that they followed it for 2 years to get Jerusalem, they would have looked up and goes, oh, there it is, because they had such familiarity with it. But no, they hadn't seen the star since the day that Christ was born. And now we are almost 2 years later. They rejoiced with exceedingly great joy because they hadn't seen the star in close to 2 years. And now all of a sudden, here it is again, not only just visible, but moving and guiding and bringing them closer to the King of the Jews, eventually standing over the house of Mary and Joseph. Can you imagine the excitement that they must have felt? Now, there's nothing in the scriptures, there's nothing grammatical in the language to indicate that the star was there the whole time. And again, in the Magi, the Magi, in Matthew's report of what the Magi said, they used the simple past tense. We have seen his star in the east. Literally, we saw his star, past tense, no indication of something that was ongoing for a period of time in the past. It was just an event. Now, this brings me to my final thoughts and question. We know that there is no natural phenomena that could do what the star did. Now, we have to be careful to not interpret the word star from our modern, scientific perspective. We know what stars are. In the ancient world, anything that was a shining light in the sky was a star, whether it was a star, a planet, or even a comet. In fact, in the ancient world, comets were called hairy stars because the tail of the comet looked like wisps of hair. And planets were called wandering stars. In fact, the Greek word planetoi means wanderer. So wandering stars were planets because unlike all other stars which seemed to be fixed in a canopy, within that backdrop, the planets actually would move independent of all the other stars that were in the background. So here's the question: what did God actually do when he caused the star to appear? Again, there's all these conjectures from Christian astronomers trying to make natural phenomena fit into this scenario. It just doesn't work. Now, if my analysis is correct, if the star rose in the west and not the east, defying all laws of nature, even if it rose in the east the way it normally does. But let's assume for the moment that it rose in the west and the Magi were in the east when they saw it rising over Bethlehem and Jerusalem. If my analysis is correct, is that it appeared and then it disappeared, then it reappeared and moved and stood still over a single house. And we don't know how high in the sky this would be. We have no other details. There's no natural phenomena that could have done that. And in fact, it couldn't have been a star in the sense that you and I know stars. Can you imagine the gravitational atmospheric chaos that would cause if God plucked a star out of the heavens and moved it around and just kind of hung it as a guide for the Magi? I don't think it was a star at all, even though it appeared to be a star to an observer. So let me tell you my theory. And it is a theory, but I've come to believe that this is accurate. And I believe it's accurate because I can't really see any other solution. And once I share it with you, I think you're going to go, I get it. I think you're right. Hopefully you will. I want you to go to Isaiah 14. If you want, you can just follow what's up on the screen right now. There are several verses that use the word star in reference to angelic beings. In speaking of the fall of Lucifer, Isaiah 12:14, how you were fallen from heaven, this is the Septuagint, O day star, O son of dawn, how you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. In Jude, where Jude is speaking of false Christians who have come in and they're intentionally deceiving and misleading other Christians, Jude compares these rebels, these apostates, really, he compares them to the Jews who refused to go into the promised land. They didn't trust God. He compares them to Sodom and Gomorrah. He compares them to the fallen angels who, as he says, left their first estate. And then he uses four metaphors from nature. He compares these people to empty clouds, to fruitless trees, to foaming waves that have no power. And finally, in Jude 13, he says, he calls them wandering stars, for whom is reserved the blackness of darkness forever. And if you read any commentaries on this particular verse, most commentators agree that Jude is linking this reference to wandering stars and darkness back to the fallen angels that he referred to a few verses before, who were, basically they rebelled, they broke rank, and they were reserved in chains and darkness. So again, we have another star reference to angelic beings. Then in Revelation chapter 9, verse 1, then the fifth angel sounded, and I saw a star fallen from heaven to the earth. To him was given the key to the bottomless pit. And then he opens the abyss, and we see these demonic entities coming out again in Revelation chapter 9, another reference of an angelic being a star. Revelation 12, this is actually something we're talking about recently in our Berean study. And another sign appeared in heaven. This is verse 3. Behold, a great fiery red dragon, which is Satan, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns or diadems on his heads. His tail drew a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. This is referring to how it wasn't just Satan who rebelled, but he took a third of the angelic host with him. And then in Luke 10:18, while the word is not identical, the concept is, Jesus said when he was talking to his disciples before he sent the 70 out to perform miracles, he said, and he said to them, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. Now take all of these references where angelic beings are being metaphorically spoken of as stars, and I want you to go now to Luke chapter 2. Luke chapter 2. We're going to read in verse 1. And I have to tell you that this is probably my favorite part of the Bible. I cannot read this, and this has been like this for me since I was a kid. I cannot read this without getting chill bumps. And it came to pass in those days that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. The census first took place while Quirinius was governing Syria. So all went to be registered, everyone to his own city. Joseph also went up from Galilee, out of the city of Nazareth into Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, whose betrothed wife, who was with child. Remember, the seed of the woman and the womb of David. So it was that while they were there, the days were completed for her to be delivered, and she brought forth her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. Now, if you remember back to a lesson we did sometime last year, this inn actually would have been a synagogue. Synagogues were not just places where religious people met to read the Torah and study and discuss things. They doubled as waypoints, as inns that travelers could stay in. Verse 8, now there were in the same country shepherds living out in the fields, keeping watch over their flock by night. And behold, an angel of the Lord stood before them. And notice this, the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were greatly afraid. Then the angel said to them, do not be afraid, for behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy, which will be to all people. For there is born to you this day in the city of David a Savior, who is Christ the Lord. And this will be the sign to you. You will find a babe wrapped in swaddling clothes, lying in a manger. And suddenly there was with the angel a multitude of the heavenly host, praising God and saying, glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill toward men. So it was when the angels had gone away from them into heaven, literally the Greek means into the sky or into the atmosphere, that the shepherds said to one another, let us now go to Bethlehem and see this thing that has come to pass, which the Lord has made known to us. We'll end there. So here's my theory. The star that the Magi saw while they were in the east watching and waiting for the sign of the king, the sign that told them that the King of the Jews was born, I believe it was the glory of the Lord that was shining around the heavenly host, the angelic host that announced the birth of the king. And if so, it would have become visible to people who are watching as that heavenly host left the shepherds and went up into the heavens. But it was an event. It was short term. They didn't hang out up there and shine the glory of the Lord for 2 years while the Magi needed to orient themselves to find their way to Jerusalem. None of that makes sense based on what we know of the history and the travel. When the Magi showed up almost 2 years later, the star that guided them to Christ's home, this shining brightness that probably came from an angel or an angelic host, was also pointing them to the place where the Christ child was. Now, hopefully that's a wonderful thought to end our story and our study on Rosh Hashanah. Given that this is Rosh Hashanah is the chief day of the year, it's the Jewish New Year, I pray that the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, our Savior, keeps you in the palm of his hand throughout this next year, and may you rest nestled safely in the shadow of the Almighty. God bless, and we'll talk to you again soon.